I'm happy to introduce the first speaker, Darren Griffin. Darren joined the school in 2004 from Brunel University. His main interests are in the study of chromosomes, principally in humans and birds. Other interests include allelic variation and its relationship to fatness and studies relating to e-learning. In 2007, he became a BBSRC Carrier Development Fellow with a remit to exploit microarray technology for studies of copy number variation in birds and humans. Darren is going to speak with us on making sense of PGS, EBM, RCTs, mosaicism, and remodeling and reconciling the two sides. Darren.
Okay, thanks, Errol. It's a delight to be here in Barcelona, and equally a delight to be able to give a talk without any data, but I'll do my best. So, will that get our first slide up? Oh, no, come back. There we go. So, first of all, we're all giving our list of disclosures. I do sometimes wonder when people say nothing to declare, they may be deluding themselves a little, because we've all got biases. I should say I do have a little bit of funding from Genesis Cooper, Genesis Genetics, now Cooper. I'd like to declare that in 1993, in my sleep, I threatened to shoot Santiago Monet. That is true. I do have a lot of good friends in the PGS world, and I'll tell you something about my other conflicts of interest as we go. So, I'd like to tell you a little bit about aneuploidy and mosaicism. We've heard a lot. This is a somewhat of a personal view, hopefully from a slightly different perspective. What I think about evidence-based medicine and how we should apply it to in the world of reproduction. Have we learnt the right lessons from PGS? Thinking of some ways forward, and I'm pleased to see that some of these ways forward are actually happening as a result of some of the things we've heard today. Tell you what my real conflict of interest is before going ahead to conclude. So, headlines of aneuploidy. We've heard this a few times already, and the premise of PGS, or PGTA, or whatever we want to call it now, is that aneuploidy is bad, so we should use all the tools at our disposal to eliminate it from IVF cycles. But is it that simple, particularly in the light of mosaicism? Start off with a definition. Mosaicism, the existence of two or more chromosomally distinct cell population in an embryo or fetus. So bear that in mind that we are talking about, we're not just necessarily talking about IVF embryos. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to focus pretty much on whole chromosome aneuploid mosaics, although some of the things will apply to segmental mosaics and segmental aneuploidies as well. Now, how does aneuploidy arise? Well, thanks to Eugene's talk this morning, I managed to add 3 or 4 to this list. I'm not going to go through it all. The point is, it's complicated. You know, all sorts of different mechanisms can lead to aneuploidy. Strictly speaking, we might just break it down into a couple. The first being this. Imagine normal meiosis in the egg and sperm, normal fertilization, but then some sort of post-zygotic error. This could be chromosome loss or gain, and that's probably a little bit more typical than what you'll find in the textbooks, which will tell you it's a 3-to-1 mitotic non-disjunction, although that does occur as well. The point here is if you have a post-zygotic error from a normal fertilization, more often than not, less than 50% of the cells will be affected, unless it happens at a very, very early stage. And thus, you might get a blastocyst that has some cells that are abnormal, some that are normal, perhaps in this case, in the trophectoderm. By way of contrast, if we start with a meiotic error and a conceptus with 47 chromosomes, and then some sort of trisomy rescue, embryo correction, whatever you want to call it, by and large, you're going to have a scenario where more than 50% of the cells are affected. Now, hold that thought, because I'm going to keep coming back to it. Now, it may be a surprise to this audience here that the vast majority of people in this world don't have children by having IVF, they have it by having sex. And in reality, and in the real world, we need to think about mosaicism in its global context. By and large, when we get a mosaic, all the things that we know about with aneuploidy apply. Sometimes they can be milder because of the presence of normal cells, but some of the issues that tend to be brought out an awful lot in terms of mosaicism are things like intrauterine growth retardation, intrauterine death, placental insufficiency, and so on. And if you look back in the data around the 1990s, when different cell layers of the chorionic villi were being looked at, one of the figures that becomes really quite clear is that of all trisomic conceptuses, at least 30% are mosaic, and these are the ones that have been found. So that's almost certainly an underestimate. And the patterns are very, very chromosome specific. They vary from chromosome to chromosome. And, as we've heard in the context of IVF, but certainly it's in the context of all conceptuses, mosaic trisomies can proceed uneventfully to term, particularly if they're in that first category of the post-zygotic errors. And in fact, more than half, the majority of post-zygotic trisomies are clinically uneventful. So, excuse the quality of this graph here. I had to, I've got a paper on my desk that I had to dig out of the back of a cupboard somewhere and take a photograph on my iPhone. If you can see, it consists of open and closed circles. The coloured-in circles are the ones that have some sort of pathology. The open circles are the affected ones. So this is all trisomies except 13, 18, and 21. Then the next thing you'll note that it's like a little box. And what this tells you is that, by and large, when you see mosaicism, it's confined to one germ cell layer. If the error arises by meiosis, the second one that I showed you, then we have problems, by and large. So meiotic errors are far more clinically relevant than post-zygotic ones. Although, if an awful lot of cells are affected post-zygotically, again, we can have problems. So, the message I'd like to get across to you today is we tend to be stuck in our little IVF bubble here because that's what we're on. That's what we're about in this conference. But it's not necessarily what we're talking about mosaicism in general. Detection of normal aneuploidy cells in a 5-to-cell trophectoderm biopsy is not, by definition, mosaicism. If you observe it, then unless you've got some sort of technical error, then you almost certainly have a mosaic embryo. So if you've taken 5 cells and you've got the evidence from your NGS trace that 2 or 3 of them are normal and 2 or 3 are abnormal, then yes, we do. But one of the things I'd like to argue to you is that I think if you take a look at the data, and a lot of this is FISH data, and extrapolate from when mosaicism has been detected, I think if you don't observe it, then you probably still have a mosaic embryo. Because I think probably, and one of the drums I'm going to bang quite hard is that someone needs to do the study cell by cell of blastocyst embryos to really establish what the level of mosaicism is. And I don't think we know that. So some people would argue, well, if that's the case, isn't PGS useless then? And we may have heard that argument strongly expressed yesterday. Now, I'm not going to go through all the literature. That's for another day. And all studies say something slightly different. But you can, if you choose to interpret the data, to say, actually, majority of embryos have at least one cell, so this is blastocyst embryos, at least one cell that's chromosomally different to the rest, or more. So we're breaking these down into 3. So the 2 I've shown you already, the meiotic and the post-zygotic, but let's not forget that an awful lot of embryos are, for the purposes of this talk, I'll call chaotic, where they have multiple abnormalities that differ from cell to cell. Now, please take these numbers with a pinch of salt. I got them off the top of my head. It's very, very variable on the study that you read. But in some studies, you see figures of 5 to 10%, somewhat chaotic. Meiotic mosaicism, well, depends what you read. You can read it up to 20%. Some people say in older women, it might be even up to 50%. Again, pinch of salt time. And as I said to you, well, maybe the rest have at least one cell that's chromosomally different to the others. Maybe. Now, of course, if we have multiple chromosome abnormalities in an embryo, we do not want to transfer that. PGS is already doing that. Okay? And, as I've argued, a meiotic mosaic, if it's a rising in meiosis in the first instance, that needs to be screened out, and we're already doing that. But it's our post-zygotic ones is the ones that we need to look at more closely, because these are tricky. And as we heard from Santi this morning, we think some of the incidences will vary between clinics. Now, if that's the case, then some clinics need to up their game a little bit. And then the pathology, does this actually lead to anything that, that might give the patients a problem, intrauterine growth retardation, large, small birth weights, whatever? Depends on a number of things, the chromosome that's involved, the lineage that's involved, but by and large, the proportion of cells that are involved. So I think that if you had an otherwise normal embryo that had 1 cell out of 100 that had trisomy 8, you're probably all right. Equally, if 70% of the cells were trisomy 8, there would be a problem and it would probably be a spontaneous abortion. But I think the basic research is somewhat lacking. And I do quite like this idea. I know it gets wheeled out. I think there's not a huge amount of evidence yet, but the idea that a little bit of grunge in your placenta might be a good thing for the invading syncytial trophoblast there. So I'll just put that thought in your head, and I think it's an area that we really need to look at in a lot more detail. So is a little bit of aneuploidy just a normal thing? So let's just hold all those thoughts and then turn our attention to the evidence base in PGS. Now, if you take your phone out and Google evidence-based medicine, you come up with a definition like this: an approach to medical practice designed to optimize decision-making by emphasizing the use of well-designed and well-conducted research. But obviously, the terms well-designed and well-conducted are subjective ones. Let's not forget that we work in an area of medicine that is incredibly odd. Yeah? It's one of the few occasions where people have radical therapies with no intention to benefit their own health. And it's a sort of area where these little good gardening skills, be it in the IVF lab, be it amongst the clinicians and stimulation protocols, can make such a difference. We're getting an awful lot of different academic disciplines all coming together. It's one of the reasons why it's so excited. And I think it's pretty much the only discipline in which the physiologies of 2 individuals come together with the sole purpose of making a third. I don't think I'm saying anything controversial if I say that some centres are better than others. But one of the things we need to carefully consider, of course, at what stage do we think the evidence base for anything, of course we're focusing on PGS, is good enough to introduce a new therapy? Because there are plenty out there, and they're sometimes referred to as add-ons. You know. And, does this apply to other areas of medicine as well? Now, one view of evidence-based medicine is this pyramid. Therapy should only be introduced in the clinic after there's been at least one favourable, double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trial. And until then, everything is just a trial and it's an experimental. And of course, this works in many different areas of medicine. So should it be the same for IVF and PGS? Well, we have a problem. There are not many ways in which you can introduce a placebo. I would scratch my head to say, so the top of the pyramid immediately goes. We know the skill of the operator, or the lack of the skill of the operator, can negate any beneficial effect. How blind can you make a study? If you're comparing biopsy versus not biopsy, do the operator not know that they're doing the biopsy? And one of the things I'd like to argue is sometimes the results from single centres may just be just as useful to the bigger picture as the randomized trials. And the meta-analyses, although I don't want to put these studies down because they're hugely important, may mask any particular bad or particularly good practice by individual clinics. So, we've seen the evidence base for PGS. I'm not going to cover that. We know that there's some randomized, some non-randomized trials, some single-center studies, and just a few examples. We've seen these graphs a couple of times already so far. Most of them, I think it's fair to say, show a beneficial effect for PGS, but not all. And we know that there's a little bit of discussion that goes on about whether PGS is a good thing or not. And, we know it's extracted criticism because of the study design, intent to treat, and so on. And we're awaiting the results of the STAR trial as we speak. So the case of the prosecution is that PGS is not properly validated. We must always wait for the results of a randomized trial with intent to treat before we introduce a new technology. The people who make this argument would say that clinics are motivated by the need to be seen to be innovating and making money. It's unethical and unfair, I've heard people say, to subject patients to such treatments until the case is proven with an RCT. And I've certainly stood in meetings like this and heard the phrase, "How do you sleep at night if you don't believe this?" You know, and they would say that PGD is a good lesson. Equally, some people would say, well, there is sufficient evidence already out there to justify continuing PGS. They would also say that in reproductive medicine, we just can't always wait for the randomized trial. You know, if you just change your media, you know, or if you want to change your media, are you going to wait until the clinical trial, or are you going to try something? You know? Innovation is good. By and large, the better clinics are the ones that innovate, in my opinion, and an awful lot of reproductive medicine, particularly bits of IVF, might never have been implemented at all had we had to wait for the trials. Trials can take years, are expensive, but nonetheless quite poorly funded, and then sometimes you know the benefits of the treatment before the results are out, and then the appetite may have waned. So sometimes, and one of the nice things about working with people in social policy and law, sometimes it allows you to sort of try and conceptualize some arguments. So I'd like to introduce you to two straw men. So if you're unfamiliar with the term a straw man approach, then basically what you try and do is take the most extreme point of view of someone. Now I have to say that Jacob and Giuseppe are really PhD students in my lab, okay? So they don't actually believe what I'm about to tell you that they believe. I'm just deliberately being controversial. So Jacob, let's imagine, is a medical statistician who gets very angry about any evidence that supports PGS. Evidence-based medicine, he says all the time, that's his mantra. On the other hand, we have Giuseppe, who's a clinician who will always advocate PGS. He wants to keep his IVF center open, and he will always accentuate things that show, studies that show PGS in a positive light. Okay, those are our two straw men. I would like to hope that, by and large, of course, there will be extremes of opinions, our great Jacobs and our Giuseppes, but by and large, we get a sort of normal distribution, and if we saw some empirical evidence against it, it might shift it in one direction, or some evidence for it, perhaps a little bit in the other direction. This is not an empirical study. This is what I observe when I come to meetings like this. A little bit of evidence comes out, and it just seems to polarize opinion. It causes more arguments. I personally think that some of the points made by each of the sides are really quite valid from time to time. But there seems to be an awful lot of not listening to one another and not being reasonable. So, have we learnt the right lessons from PGS? Well, if I can invoke the ghost of Mastenbrook for a moment, think back to that very famous study of 2007. One interpretation of the data is this, that if you look in their discussion, there is a figure that suggests, or a number that suggests that they did some cleavage stage biopsy, but no diagnosis, and got a 6% live birth rate. And when they compared that with a cleavage stage biopsy and transfer following fish diagnosis, the fish almost trebled their live birth rate. And actually, the number that that ended up with the control group was basically higher than the rest of it, because this was the 16 and the 6% combined. Now, that is one interpretation of the data. So, some would argue that this is evidence that cleavage stage biopsy, not fish diagnosis, is the bad guy. But here's the question. Is it cleavage stage biopsy in general, or just the way that those people were performing it? So, what do we learn? Well, you know, of course RCTs should be the gold standard for evidence-based medicine. But I think it's important to say that just because a study is a randomized trial does not necessarily mean that it's a good study, particularly if it's badly performed. And the converse applies. Just because it's not a randomized trial does not necessarily mean it's not a good study. So trying to conceptualize the evidence-based pyramid, I wonder whether we should just think of it as a little bit more of a gentler hill. So rather than trying to get to the top of the mountain and capture the flag, just think that the evidence base as a whole, because these individual trials may be really, really important to the bigger picture. Do you really want to go into these studies with an open mind? Well, yeah, in science you do. If you want to do a scientific study, of course you want to go into an open mind. But we're not talking about a scientific study. We're talking about couples going into clinics. You know, if you and your partner are seeking fertility treatment, do you want to go to a clinic that's making absolutely sure they want this treatment to work, or one that has an open mind about whether it'll work or not? Do you want to go to a hamburger restaurant that's run by a vegan? No, you want to go to a vegan restaurant that's run by a vegan. Yeah. And, you know, is your decision-making process along the lines of a survey that said that the British people like hamburgers? Again, no. The other thing I think it's worth considering, which I don't think has been mentioned just yet, what the legal and ethical implications of not implementing PGS. And the harm caused to a patient who has an aneuploid pregnancy, assuming that they could and would have chosen to avoid it had PGS been offered. So that's the way I quite like to conceptualize that, and it just got me thinking about hiking in the Lake District, and I'm from Yorkshire, so I'd strongly advocate you go to the Yorkshire Dales rather than the Lake District. So what did we learn from PGS? Well, we don't do cleavage stage biopsy anymore, even though some labs that are good at it have shown a benefit. We don't do FISH anymore because there are better technology out there, but some say it could have been affected. And trophectoderm biopsy, CGH, NGS are now widely employed. It's been argued that the Jacobs of this world have made the fortunes of the Giuseppes of this world, which is an interesting point of view. But I would say we don't need to be complacent. You know. We need to think about, did NGS, it certainly is a much better technology, but did it just allow us to pick out some of these tiny things that we wouldn't have spotted and just may have been benign? And I think we need to look at the meiotic error. So are the errors meiotic or post-zygotic in origin? And we can do this. We can do this right now, and we can do it with carrier mapping, because that is a carrier mapping trace that is demonstrating a meiotic error. So here's what I believe. I think most, if not all, human embryos have at least one chromosomally different cell in them. Yeah. By PGS, eliminate the chaotics, we must do it. The meiotics, we must do it, but we need to be cleverer at interpreting these post-zygotic errors. Yeah. Some trials will not show a benefit of PGS, I bet you. But the reasons for that might not be because PGS is a bad thing, but because they just generally have some high levels of post-zygotic aneuploidies and low pregnancy rates, and maybe their biopsy technique isn't very good. We've heard from Alan in the last talk that PGS can work using this one-by-one strategy. So I think a way forward is that PGS, personally, on balance, should continue. The NGS has got great potential, but there is much to improve. And yes, the randomized trials are very, very important, but good statistics and good design alone don't necessarily make a good study. So we've heard something not dissimilar to this from Santi already. I think we have a group of abnormalities that we can spot now that we just say no. Anything meiotic, anything chaotic, trisomies 21, 18, 13. Of course, if no abnormality, then fine. But let's just consider this grey area, this amber light here. Things that we might want to think about, the level of the abnormality, the chromosome involved. And as an example here in the top right, I'm just showing you a graph for trisomy 3. So trisomy 3, if you see it in a mosaic state, by and large you see that they're not very close circles there, okay? They're always confined to the trophectoderm, and only when a large proportion of the cells are affected. Right, this is my conflict of interest. I want to find out lots of things and publish papers on them. Okay, and this, I'm running out of time, so I won't go through every last one of them, but you get the idea. I'm not a clinician. I don't run a diagnostic lab, and I don't have any shares in companies, but I am a researcher that runs a research lab. My life will be better, my career will be better, including getting invited to lovely conferences like this one, if more research gets done. So yes, of course I'm going to say this. It's never been more important to perform basic research on model systems, moving on to human embryos. Please, those of you who are the decision makers in companies, please get your heads together with the research councils and the charities to think of ways in which we can fund basic research, because there is so much to be done. Lobby for a larger slice of the funding pie and meet them halfway, because there's a prize, and the prize is better understanding of what is probably the greatest genetic hazard facing mankind. But potentially, if we get PGS right, then maybe sometime in the future we might be screening every embryo. Cost would be another issue. Now, very, very briefly, I said I don't have any data. I don't have a great deal, but just to acknowledge one or two of the bits that my students have done. Teal Taylor did a very nice study that showed that the different areas of the trophectoderm had different levels of chromosome abnormality. He also did a very wonderful proof of principle study in which he took a blastocyst embryo cell by cell and looked at the chromosome abnormalities in them, and I'll just leave you with that result there. It's not meant to be representative, it's just 3 embryos he picked out, but you see it certainly can occur where you just get an odd cell that is chromosomally abnormal. And I think, looking back at the fish data, we might find this in most embryos if we look hard enough. We're working very hard on a cattle model. It's there. Cattle IVF is out there. It's very, very well developed. It also provides a very good model for humans. And just to give you a little bit of an announcement from my lab, we've had our first carrier mapping case, not of a human, but of this little lady in the bottom corner there licking out her nose. So to conclude, I don't think we satisfactorily answered that basic question of, if we take a blastocyst embryo cell by cell and look at the chromosome abnormalities and say, have any of these got it, what is the true level of mosaicism in human embryos? We desperately need to consider the roles of mitotic versus meiotic errors. We need to think about which patient groups benefit more. Advanced maternal age presumably would. Think very closely about EQA schemes. We need not to be a Jacob or a Giuseppe. Each side has a good point. Yeah? But you might not agree, but then evidence polarizing opinion can never be a good thing. We need to think about stage introductions, not just wait for RCTs and then do it. And then the similarities and differences with evidence-based medicine in our field and others. And we need more research. I will end there just with a few acknowledgements, and to say that one of the things that we've been doing a lot of recently is combining biologists and lawyers and policymakers and psychologists in something that we call the Centre for Interdisciplinary Studies of Reproduction. And my deputy director on that, Sally Sheldon, has been very good in helping me to conceptualise some of the things I've talked to you about today. I'll end there. Thank you.